Thank you so much, Tucker.
Professor Jordan Peterson has been compared to dictators like Mao and Hitler because he won't let others dictate what he says. A brave man, one of the few. Next. Everywhere in modern society, you are ordered to conform, and if anything, it's getting more conformist, from gender to immigration. Pick your issue. There's increasingly only one acceptable view, and you can be ostracized or fired for disagreeing. Many are, in case you haven't noticed. University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson stands dramatically against this tide. He's become famous in large part because he refuses to be shamed from the public square for having his own opinions. Last week, Peterson left interviewer Cathy Newman, not a genius, speechless when explaining that people do not have the right not to be offended. Watch this.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable. That's fine. I think more power to you, as far as I'm concerned.
Except you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
ha, gotcha.
You have got me. You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head.
Really one of the great interviews of all time. By the way, you should say Jordan Peterson has a new book out, 12 Rules for Life. That clip is everywhere. Jordan Peterson joins us tonight. It's an honor to have you, Professor. So I've watched you for a while. I've always thought you were a truth teller. One of the chapters in your book is Tell the Truth. That's one of your rules. What are some of the things that you think we're forced to lie about in this moment?
Well, I don't know if we're forced. I think we make a choice. That it's sometimes a bitter choice, but that's often the case when you're deciding what to say. But my sense is often you're in a situation where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, so you might as well pick the poison you'd rather take. And you have a moral obligation to do that. So, you know, if you're going to say something unpopular and you're going to get attacked for it, that's a risk. But to shut up and pretend that you think something different is to warp your soul, and that's a much bigger risk. So
yes, it is. So why I would think that even if they didn't agree with you, that people in the media would be thrilled by the way you comport yourself, the way you respond, because clearly you're saying what you really think, and that's supposed to be our charge as journalists, is to tell the truth.
Well,
and yet you get met with these hostile receptions. Why do you think that is?
Well, I would say that's not universal. There's a big battle being played out in the press, say over the Cathy Newman interview. There are people who are casting her as a victim because she's been vilified as a consequence of the interview. But there's been many, many people in the media who stood forth and said that it's necessary to be able to say what you think. So it's not a battle that's over yet. Yeah, it's good. It's good. Surprising, but good.
So if you, in the book, you have a number of these rules, and Rule 5 just jumped out at me as a father. You said, here's a rule. Don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. What does that mean?
Well, it means, first of all, that you should understand that you are actually capable of disliking your children, and that because you're larger and more powerful than them, if you let them misbehave in a way that makes you dislike them, you're going to take revenge on them in a very bad way, and sometimes over decades. I've seen that as a clinical psychologist. But more importantly, if your children behave in ways that make you dislike them, assuming you're reasonable, and that might be something you want to discuss with your wife, then other people are going to dislike them too, other adults, and then they won't teach them things, and they won't pay attention to them, and they'll only smile falsely at them, and other children won't want to play with them and include them, and that's a catastrophe for your child. So it's very helpful to help your children behave in ways that make other people welcome them, because then everywhere they go, they're welcome. And there's nothing better you can do for a child than that.
Very smart. In the minute we have left, if you could pass on one piece of life advice, and this really is a book of life advice, to our viewers, what would it be?
Stop saying things that make you weak.
What does that mean?
Well, if you pay attention to what you say, you'll know that sometimes you feel like you're standing on a rock, that you're in a solid place, and I suppose that you're speaking from your heart. And other times you're saying things just to look good and just to buttress your particular status at the time, and that makes you feel weak. You sell yourself out. And if you pay attention to what you say, you can tell when you're making yourself stronger, and you can tell when you're making yourself weaker. And unless you want to be weaker, then I would say it's best to say those things that make you strong. And you can learn to do that, and it's really useful. So I would recommend practicing that because it's good for you and good for everyone else too. And so
there's a reason people obsessively watch your YouTube videos. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. Congrats on the book.
Thanks very much.
Turns out a scandal is rocking the limited but vigorous world of Saudi beauty pageants, probably not in the way you would expect. We have the details on that next.
I read a fascinating interview with you, and you were talking about the plight of young men and how guys really need to get their act together. You went on to say the lack of an identifiable and compelling path forward and the denialism these kids are being fed on a daily basis and undoubtedly destroying them, and that is especially true of the young men. This show we've covered widely the fact that suicide is the biggest killer of young men under the age of 45 in this country. It goes on in that interview to say, at this point, to my astonishment, Peterson begins to weep.
Yeah, well, it says, see, now it did it to me again. Look, last night, I was at this talk I gave, and about 1,000 people came, and about 500 of them stayed afterwards, and most of them were young men, and just one of them after the other comes up to me, and they shake my hand, and they say, look, I've been listening to what you've been saying for 6 months, and it's changed my life. It's like I was depressed, I was addicted to drugs, my relationships weren't working out, I was hopeless, I didn't have any goal. I started cleaning up my room and telling the truth and working hard on myself, and it's really working, and I just want to thank you for helping me. And I think, God, it's so sad that so many of these men, they've not had an encouraging bloody word, a real encouraging word in their entire life. It just takes a little bit of encouragement and care so that they're willing to set themselves straight to some degree and start trying. It's just a catastrophe that's so rare in their lives. And so, yeah, well, every time, you see, because I see the same thing when I'm talking, my audiences are often composed mostly of men between, say, 20 and 35, not exactly young, but young enough. And they're desperate for a discussion about responsibility and fair play and noble being and working properly in the world, and the idea, and to hear the idea that their lives actually matter, that if they straighten themselves up and fly right, that they'll have a beneficial effect on themselves and their family and the community, and that the world is starving for that. And for them as individuals, not for them as a group, but for each of them as individuals. So, yeah, it breaks me up. Every time the topic comes up, it breaks me up because it's so damn sad. And we're so stupid. We're alienating young men. We're telling them that they're patriarchal oppressors and denizens of rape culture and tyrants in waiting, and we fail to discriminate between their competence and their tyranny. And it's awful. It's so destructive. It's so unnecessary. And it's so sad. And so whenever I think about it, especially because of all that I've seen of it, it makes me sad, like deeply. It's so sad.
Why has it happened?
Oh, God, that's a complicated question. I mean, well, it's partly happened because every culture has a tyrannical element, I mean, our culture isn't perfect. There is oppressive elements to it. It's not completely fair. So some of it is just the age-old observation that you don't get a culture without a bit of a tyranny. A lot of it is resentment and failure to take responsibility. It's people saying, instead of looking at the part they play in making the world a dark and terrible place, they blame something like the patriarchy and then assume that all the men who compose it are somehow malevolent tyrants or tyrants in waiting. It's like it's ideological possession. There's just no excuse for it. It's motivated by resentment.
Does
mostly.
Feminism have a role to play in that?
Well, it depends on how you define feminism. If it's the feminism that says, wouldn't it be lovely if women could offer what they have to the world so that the world would be a better place on the same footings as men? Well, no, that's great. If it's the feminism that says that Western culture is an evil, corrupt patriarchy, then absolutely. There's no excuse for that sort of thing, and it completely dominates the universities, especially in the humanities. Like, we really believe, most left-wing academics believe, that the Western culture is a corrupt patriarchal tyranny. I mean, God, wake up. Most governments in the world are run by thugs, absolute thugs. They'll kick in your door and kill you in your sleep. In the West, we have, well, a wonderful civilization. People are as free as they've ever been. You can live well here as an individual. And to consider that, you know, a corrupt patriarchal tyranny, and to lay that at the feet of young men, and then to tell them that they have to be discriminated against because of the systemic, let's say, racism and misogyny of the past. It's appalling. And men are bailing out of universities at a rate. This is not my opinion. I've been tracking these statistics for 15 years. Men are bailing out of universities at a rate you just would not believe. There won't be a man left in the humanities in 15 years at this rate. All you have to do is look at the trends. It's quite obvious, and it's no wonder. So, and it's just appalling. And I've also been described as misogynist because, you know, I've been trying to strengthen young men. It's like, of all the ridiculous ideas, that strengthening young men is somehow misogynist. I mean, God, how can, it's just, I can't even believe what you would have to